In this last chapter of Sri Aurobindo's commentary on the Kena Upanishad, we have come to the culmination of what the Kena is leading the practitioner to, and that is the transfiguration of the self and the working of the gods in us. For the working of the gods, we have seen the means. As there is a turning upward and a visitation of the divine light, power and sense into the working of the gods within us, these gradually learn to become passive to the touch of the divine action, and then increasingly giving themselves to that influence until gradually the higher working fills the lower working of the gods, liberates its smallness or limitation, and opens out to the larger cosmic action, and eventually opens out to the principle behind even the cosmic action. So there is a first stage in which our lower nature, narrow, individual, bound in smallness, egocentricity, is released from its narrowness and opens out to a larger cosmic working. Our mind becomes one with the cosmic mind, our life with the cosmic life, our senses with the cosmic working of senses. And then a second stage in which they exceed beyond this cosmic working to that which the cosmic working represents. So this is described as the principle of all principles, to the divine power in its most essential working, which pours to become cosmic working, which individualizes within us. So there is this transformation taking place through this process, where increasingly the gods within us, the psychological powers, no more act by their old habit, but by a larger working first through the cosmos, and eventually by diviner working on a new principle of action, where the divine himself pours through this working in us. This is the transfiguration of the gods. The result is that all this working not only becomes impersonal, unlimited to any particular acts or enjoyment, but the whole thing opens out to a boundless, grandiose and immortal operation. The material world itself will become for these gods a figure of the infinite, luminous and blissful superconscient, and we dwelt on this earlier. If this is the transfiguration of the gods, what about the self which is in the center of this working, which is needed as a focal point upon which the working of the gods can settle, around which they can organize themselves? What happens to this self? This is what we take up now. The self of man, Sri Aurobindo writes, since it is the essentiality of a mental being, will do through the mind. How is this self that we are going to open out to the true self? What is this self? What is that self? This is fundamentally different. It is an inferior working, action, reflection, etc. It is essentially mental. That is free supra-mental. This cannot know that. That cannot be bound in this. And so, how are we to ever know that? Because we have been told already by the Kena, the thought cannot seize that. And if you think you have it, then you don't have it. So the starting point is this, the self of man will do through the mind. Why? Since it is the essentiality of a mental being. Now here we come to something very important, and we will briefly step back to the larger picture of evolution, and then we will explore this statement. We would ask the question first, why is all this drama necessary? First you limit yourself and then you go through a struggle to liberate yourself. What's the point of it? Why at all bind yourself in an inferior, limited, lesser existence? Even the gods in their working are bound, and then they have to realize that they are insufficient, that there is a greater working. What's the point of that, if the whole goal was to get out and reconnect with the whole working anyway? And here we must see the origin of this binding. It is not as if all that large cosmic working has suddenly focused into a narrow working and made itself narrow. In fact, the starting point of it was an emergence out of inconscience. So the first thing you see is nothing, nations, zero, emptiness, empty space. Even the form of matter is something. But the first thing that has happened when the Divine has poured Himself into self-loss is a nothing. There is only empty space. And somehow in that empty space, physics teaches us, there is this seething virtual play of particles. Virtual in the sense that they are unstable. You cannot seize on something and say this is that particle, because by the time you seize upon it, it's already changed or vanished. But in that seething virtual play of energy, there are bindings. The virtuals combine to create an overall stable center. And there is the foam of matter which emerges in what is otherwise empty space. In this foam of matter, there is no mind, no life. But something in that foam pushes matter. And so we have a sequence of more and more complex form of matter emerging. We call them the elements. And they grow even more complex, they combine in various ways. And somehow through that transition of complexity, something emerges which appears like life, which goes through many transitions of complexity, becoming more and more conscious of its impulse to live, and grows into a conscious being living, and eventually becomes self-conscious being, as in the human mind. Now if you see the origination of all this, it is not as if the cosmic gods have poured themselves to become this narrow working. It's not as if the large cosmic working suddenly came and got itself bound into a knot. There was a nothing. And as if out of a nothing, these things have emerged. And so in their emergence, you do not see a connection with the cosmic working. If at all there is a cosmic connection, it is indirect through the screen of non-existence. And so when we come into ourselves as human beings thinking, we have the impression that our thought is a product of our body. Our life is a product of our body. Take away the matter and I will cease to be. It feels like that. And at this point, the thought is actually bound in the material working of the brain and biology. It is bound and encased so tightly, even if it wants to be free of it, it cannot. There is still the free cosmic working around. And that's why the need for a gradual breaking out of this limited binding to reconnect with the cosmic working. But so far, the cosmic working was there, operating inside, but because it passed through the screen of no form, non-existence, what leaks through is a very tiny piece. The little tiny piece of the cosmic working which was in those particles which combined to become a stable atom. And the little working which was in all those stable atoms which combined to become the cell, and the little working on the cell which combined, and so on. But there was always a little working, something of the cosmic working through the screen of complete unconscious, emerging, forming, but always bound to littleness, defining itself, supporting itself on smallness and incapacity. And now this opening out from this limitation is a big step. If we look at the big picture of evolution, maybe a few million years down, this growth which is going on would naturally widen out. And in widening, eventually might connect with the freer working in the cosmos. And so it makes sense. We can see the progression. Oh yes, it has to eventually connect, because actually it is that working, but through the filter of the screen of inconscience in a small, limited capacity. We may take an analogy here. You have the ocean and you have the land. Let's say the land is somewhat large enough that you do not see the waters of the ocean. And you dig a well. You find some water down there. You do not know that the ocean water has seeped in through the ground and come there. And you take it out and you think, oh, this is all that I have. I have to survive on this. I have to somehow work with this limited capacity. And the entire village life is organized around this little pocket of the well. Not knowing that if they could go to the source, out there is all the water. Remove the ocean, put a river so that you don't have salty water, but still. But it's all there. And it's something like this. Here, through the filtration of the inconscient, the connection, the continuity with the universal free working of universal mind, life and sense has been cut off. We entered a state of complete stupor and self-loss, and out of that awakened in this little binding of the pocket that this body, matter, has created. And so, is there something out there? I do not even know. I do not feel. I do not sense. And we need the teaching to tell us, oh yes, there is something, and this is the means by which you can open out to that. Having thus opened out even to the cosmos, it's not enough. Where did that cosmic working come from? And there is this teaching which reminds us there is a greater principle of all these principles, to which eventually we have to merge or join with. And so this is the process for the working of the gods, the psychological powers in us, in our mind, in our senses, in our life energies, even in the body. But I, who am now conscious in this, as the center of the awareness, I am fundamentally different from this working of the gods. You see, when the eyes are seeing, when the mind is thinking, I don't know how they think. I don't know how they see. I only experience the sight. I only enjoy the thought. I participate in the life and, so to say, nourish myself from it. I grow through those experiences. But what makes them work, I do not know. The gods are doing it. This is the lower working of the gods which must open out to the higher and so on. But I am not conscious of them. I am not doing it. It's happening. You would say it's nature doing it. I am only participating or reflecting or nourishing myself from this experience. This is fundamentally different, the center of the I. So the way the gods were awakened was through the higher power entering repeatedly to transform them. Sri Aurobindo writes in the next sentence, in the gods, the transfiguration is effected by the superconscient itself visiting their substance and opening their vision with its flashes until it has transformed them. Because otherwise they were incapable and you were not capable of changing them. If you say, you must enter your biological sight and amplify the vision, do you think you can do that? You can, to some extent, close your eyes, open your eyes, look more carefully, observe more carefully. There's some degree of influence that your willpower can have on this working. But you cannot say, I will train my mind to begin to see in ultraviolet or infrared light, or even to see X-rays or terahertz waves. Impossible. Because you are bound to the working as it is. They need to have something working on them to transform them. You cannot directly affect, except to some degree. But to your own awareness, you can do much more. To your own awareness, you can say, I turn my awareness to this or that. I direct my thought towards something. I can turn my own attention in ways that I cannot, the working of my mind or my body. And it is this which he is pointing to. The self of man will do through the mind, since it is the essentiality of a mental being. And he explains this. The mind is capable of another action, which is only apparently movement of mind, but really the movement of the self towards its own reality. The mind seems to go to that. Now all of this we understand when we recall that the way the Kena taught us to turn to know the Brahman is to know that of it which is in you, that of it which is in the gods. This Sri Aurobindo described in this first sentence of this chapter. He says, to go behind the nature and the self of the individual, to go behind this to the beyond which they represent. And the means of the knowledge of Brahman are, we have seen, to get back behind the forms of the universe to that which is essential in the cosmos. And that which is essential is twofold: the gods in nature and the self in the individual. So first we have to get back to that which is essential, and then to go behind these to the beyond which they represent. So in what you go to the essential and then the beyond, and the same thing now with the self. What is essentially myself? And this is the question, this is the means. This, the self of man, since it is the essentiality of a mental being, will do through the mind. So the self of man is the essentiality of a mental being. Why is that so? Observe the dog. The essentiality of the dog is not his mental being, it is an emotional being. The essentiality of plant is neither mental being nor emotional being, but pure life impulse. What is it that is essentially you? What is it that is essentially makes you you? And the conclusion we have is that the essentiality is mental being. If you were given a choice, you have now, for example, with modern technology, they offer to replace everything. So you can have a hip replacement, knee replacement, more complex arm replacement. How far would you go? Heart replacement. People don't mind that. Brain replacement, maybe. But if you say mind replacement, no, that will change me. You see? You are changing the very essentiality of my identity. If you change my arm, it does not change my identity. Change my hips, it doesn't change my identity. Even my physical heart, maybe even my emotional center might be modified, but it won't change my identity. But when you change my mind, then I'm gone. So the essentiality of a mental being is what we are focused on. And through the mind we turn to what is the essentiality of our mind. So the question would be placed, what is it in your mind that makes you you? Is it the particular pattern of thoughts? When you were a child, you had certain prejudices. Now as an adult, they are gone. You have other prejudices, perhaps more complex, but still, they can change further. They won't change you. except superficially. What is it that is essentially in you that is you? And this is the introspective process which takes us inward to the essence of mind. This, the self of man, since it is the essentiality of mental being, will do through the mind. And you cannot do it through other means. Now, when you say mind here, we must understand this is, of course, the approach of the Kena. In its more complete understanding, it would include the emotional being also, because the emotions, especially the refined emotions, are part of our mental experience. We have, in the working of life force, two divisions. The part of the life energy which is identified with the mind, which makes for the higher emotions, and the part of the life energy which is identified with the body, and therefore more instinctive, which makes for the lower emotions. And the difference is very easy to recognize subjectively. When you experience fear, a danger appears and you experience a visceral fear. It grips you, it pulls you, makes you run. You can't control it. That is part of the lower instinctive nature. Somebody challenges you and questions what you have said. For a moment you are surprised or you are upset, and then you think out and respond rationally. This emotional response is part of your higher mental life. You are not seized by it and getting upset. The anger instinct belongs to the lower working. Sri Aurobindo uses the word lower vital and the higher vital. Now there are certain things which straddle both. So an anger instinct, for example, somebody insults, you get upset, okay, you can control it, but it's straddling. First reaction is in the lower vital, but a higher part of the mind is able to seize upon it, turn it, and even make positive use of it. Now I won't let him go. I am going to prove him wrong. So the anger energy is channeled, used by the higher vital. But otherwise, for those who have reasonably got purified of it, somebody challenges you and there's a response. There's an emotional reaction, but it belongs to the domain of mind. It is almost self-aware and can be modified by your awareness. So here, on this level, the higher emotions are experienced. The devotion to the divine, the love for the divine, the bhakti, all of these belong to this domain. So when we read here the mental being, it's not only the rational part of the mind, but also this higher emotional part of the mind, which is included in this understanding. Sri Aurobindo, of course, elaborates on this in the way he articulates his commentary. In the verse 5, it just uses the term mind. And it's open to interpretation, but when you think about it, it's obvious what is meant. Then in that which is of the self, as the motion of this mind seems to attain to that. Now the motion of the mind seems to attain to that. Which part of your mind is attaining to that, if you think about it? Of course, in your higher mental thinking, rational thinking, you can dwell on the idea of the infinite, the idea of the oneness, the sense of what that represents for you, and so on. But equally the heart, in this part of the mind, can share the closeness, the immersion, the enjoyment, the self-giving to that oneness, the infinite. Even a part of the senses, a very refined higher part of the senses, can dwell on it. As happens, for example, when you sit in contemplation of the sky or the ocean, something of your senses rises, as if opens out beyond the littleness and connects to the infinity. All of these belong to this part of the upward movement of the mind, which the Kena refers to. As the motion of this mind seems to attain to that, never really attaining, but seems to attain to that. So there is first a movement of the mind turning to that which it wants to know, which it knows itself to be a part of in essence. And by it afterwards, this is how verse 5 goes, and by it afterwards, the will in the thought continually remembers it. So there are two phases. There's the first movement, upward, and afterwards the will in the thought, which takes up the movement and continually remembers it. So Sri Aurobindo will elaborate on this. We come back to the commentary. But the mind is capable of another action, which is only apparently movement of mind, but really the movement of the self towards its own reality. So it seems as if at first your mind drifts and it's your mind which is wanting that. But you could ask yourself, why did your mind turn to this, of which you have no obvious compulsion? Something inside you awoke and yearned for. Something inside you turned spontaneously, knowing there is something important here. Something inside you recognized this is the direction and this is the growing closeness. What new? It is the self, the part of the self which is in you. It is that which is guiding this. So he says, but really the movement of the self towards its own reality. The mind seems to go to that, capital T. To attain to it, again seems to attain to it. It is lifted out of itself into something beyond. And although it falls back, still by the mind, the will of knowledge and the mental thought continually and at last continuously remembers that into which it has entered. So Sri Aurobindo's commentary is now elaborating the different stages of this process. The mind seems to go to that. Now, there are people who have had no formal exposure to anything relating to the idea of even God, divine, oneness, infinity, etc. Mother, for example, points out that she grew up in a family which, although Jewish in tradition, her mother was agnostic, having no particular interest in anything to do with spiritual things, and brought up the children in that mold. And yet the child, sitting quietly, looking out of the window, suddenly finds the consciousness turning in a certain direction. Where does that come from? Something innate within. We have in fact in practice seen that those who grew up in families which did not give any interest, did not offer any interest in religious or spiritual things, often had the best receptivity to a more direct experience. Those who had grown up into some mold of religious or spiritual training often were locked into the mold, blocked, unable to get free. The point being, whatever the upbringing, even with something which is a complete blank, there is something inside us which automatically turns. And it happens to everybody when we go, for example, to the top of a mountain. The reason why people are attracted to the ocean side or the top of a mountain, when you want to go on a holiday, you are not so keen to just go into another city. Yes, that has its own value momentarily. There's a novelty of cultures, forms. What you're going to see, go to the museum, go to the park, go to the... Once you've done that in a few cities, it's pretty much the same everywhere. The spaces we are drawn to, where we feel ourselves relaxing, breaking free, or losing the stresses which we have accumulated, are the beaches, mountains, rarely though forests. The spaces where you experience the openness. In the forests, perhaps, for some people, there is this sense of connection, the purity of the unsullied nature. or a lake would still be partially an opening to see into wideness, the water. But really what draws us is something which breaks out of smallness, opens out into vastness. When we come into that space, in the very fact of being there with the senses opening out, something of our deeper consciousness feels relieved, released into the wideness. The smallness is momentarily lost, and with it, the stress dissolves. We recognize that the source of all stress is smallness, struggling with smallness, struggling with its own smallness or with the smallness of things around, and struggling to break free and unable to. Here, there's a smooth, spontaneous release. The mind seems to go to that. If you think deeply, all of the human interests, anything we do in thought, where we seek more than what we have, is only pointing towards that through different facets, through different aspects or forms. When a person is struggling to become famous, make a name for himself, what is it that he's seeking? Trying to reach out to the larger humanity. That humanity may turn and say, you are something, you are someone, we respect you. But what are you looking for? You're looking for this acceptance in the large, where my smallness is finally completed in the largeness. Or a variation to this, when I want to leave my mark in life, after I go, people will remember me for this or something else. What are you seeking for? Immortality. Across time, that this little piece of fragment of my life will have a meaning which will last. And if you're more free, less self, you don't particularly care if your name is there, but still you want to leave an imprint which will last. That if I've done this one thing for humanity, even if people don't recognize, I will have made my contribution. To what? To the large eternity of evolution. When people seek anything which is beyond just their little small immediate, you will see always behind it something which represents an aspect of that. Ultimately, all things in life which give us satisfaction are things which lead us one step closer to that. So think of it in this way. Consider all that you do in your life. The things which don't give you satisfaction, observe, they are the things which did not take you a step closer to that. The things which gave you satisfaction, you will find they took you a small step, however small, but a small step towards that, through one of its aspects, any. Some people work to bring justice in the world. Social justice, political justice, legal justice, whatever form it may be. What is it that you're trying to do? The natural rhythm of the dharma, of the will of the divine to be realized, its harmony to be expressed, and you took a step towards that. Something is wrong in the disharmony that exists, you brought one step towards a greater harmony towards that. Always it's towards that. So the mind seems to go to that. This has to be understood on two levels. There is the unconscious movement towards that, which is what everybody is participating in unknowingly. And then there's the conscious movement towards that, where you begin to dwell. When you're more awake, or in your more awake moments, the mind seems to go to that. And then occasionally we are able to cross to a stage where it seems to attain to that. It is lifted out of itself into something beyond. And of course it has to fall back. And although it falls back, still we can repeat. So there is a first lifting beyond itself and then a falling back. Now again, as an experience, every time there is this lifting beyond yourself, that's when you experience the great fulfillment, the deep satisfaction, the moments of life which you remember as the most valuable. A musician, as he sings, he may sing for the performance and the adulation of those before him. He has some satisfaction. But tomorrow, the audience changes. Will I be able to satisfy them? There is this fear, anxiety. When I am able to satisfy, I am relieved. When I fall short of that satisfaction, I am upset. There's always this agitation. If the musician turns his attention not to satisfying the audience, but to the experience itself of that exaltation, then it does not matter whether the audience is satisfied or not. He has the deep satisfaction of the exaltation, and inevitably the audience participates or is lifted also in that exaltation. Those are the ones that we call the masters, master musicians. So, starting from our immediate small steps, there is a much larger step where we cease to focus on the small things, aim straight away at an exaltation. Now, the sense of exaltation can have so many facets and so many degrees. The musician may have this peak experience, but every day when he sings, something in him momentarily lifts and rises. And in that partial exaltation is also the nourishment that he receives. If we look at our own work in life, if we are involved in a work that gives us satisfaction, you will see every time that you participate in that, there is some kind of a momentary partial exaltation. But it has to come back, it has to fall back. Having had it a few times, whether a partial or a greater exaltation, there is a memory. Although it falls back, still by the mind, the will of knowledge in the mental thought continually and at last continuously remembers that into which it has entered. And it is this memory that the Kena points to now. And by it afterwards, the will in the thought continually remembers it. And this memory is extremely important, because when we have fallen back, it is the memory which retains what? Two components. The memory retains what you felt like. I remember in that state I was so happy, so peaceful, so full of light, so different, so wide, so free, whatever form. The memory of it remains. But there's a deeper component. When you remember something, it's as if some part of you relives it. Take a moment to remember an incident which moves you deeply. And when you turn to remember the thing, you notice first comes the form of the incident, and then at the core of the incident, the thing that moves you. And the memory gets you back into the experience of that moving impact. I was once visiting a spiritual community in America, and somebody came to meet the day I arrived because he had heard I was coming from Sri Aurobindo Ashram. And he sat there and said, I came specially to meet because I have been there once. And I think it was in the early 70s, after Auroville started. He said, I was visiting Chennai. He was involved in sustainable development, and somebody spoke of Auroville. He came there, stayed for 2 weeks. He had heard that there was the mother. Someone told him, you must go and meet her. And he said, what will I do, meeting an old woman? Okay, but since they insisted, he went. He reached the room, and he said he went to her, and then he doesn't know what happened. He knelt down before her, and then tears were streaming and streaming through his eyes. And there was such an incredible love pouring into him. And as he's saying all this, his eyes start streaming, and he can feel what he experienced at that point glowing out of him. And probably it was the first time he had repeated that experience after 40 years, 45 years. And as he was repeating, he started describing, and she bounced me around all over the universe. And all the time I was everywhere, bouncing around. I was completely lost and overwhelmed, and there was this incredible love pouring and pouring. And as he spoke, you could feel what he had experienced flowing out of him. So afterwards I took a video recording, I did an interview with him. But in the video it did not come as intensely still. The memory has the power to recreate or re-enter or take you into the experience again. And that's why the memory is so important. You will find repeatedly in many of the Upanishads, this power of memory is pointed to. Even in the Kena Upanishad, you will recall the last but one verse. Om Krato Smara Kritam Smara. The doer, remember, that which was done, remember. And it repeats that, remember, remember. And it's as if somewhere inside us, the original memory, the memory of our origin is there. The imprint of what we are in our origin is right here. And with it, not only the identity, but the imprint, the memory. But it's a memory we have forgotten. And the recovery of this is like remembering something you had forgotten you knew. Somewhere inside us, there is this part which knows our oneness in the divine, knows our completeness in the universe, even our oneness with the universe. It knows somewhere inside. But here on the surface, we've forgotten that we know it somewhere inside. And yet the fact that it is there inside acts in reflection on the surface as a goad. Something which feels, there's something I have to do, something I've forgotten, something missing, I don't know what. The sense of this missing is the urge, the estrus, the goad, the push, which is never satisfied. And it is never satisfied because its only satisfaction can be in the recovery of the true experience, not only in the memory of it, but in the full experience. But this dissatisfaction is what pushes us to try to find something, but I don't know what. The form it takes in the young people especially is to try out whatever is there. Perhaps this will satisfy, perhaps this, perhaps that, perhaps that. And of course, everything satisfies momentarily and partially. Nothing satisfies truly in a lasting way. And if you have been so bound in the programming or in the habit, you will simply accept. That's how it is. So I spend the rest of my life chasing partial satisfactions or giving up the hope that there can ever be a true, lasting completeness of satisfaction, which is often the case in most people. But if the memory is vivid, then you are not blindly chasing. You know it is not this. It's not in eating better food or more food that I will have that satisfaction. There's something which has not to do with the food. It has not even to do with the senses. It has to do with a turn of my feelings or thoughts. And every time my feelings rise, every time my thoughts flow and widen, I feel closer to that memory. That familiarity is there. And among these young people, you will find very quickly they gravitate to experiences of life which nourish, to spiritual experiences or things which represent the spiritual. So when we look at this whole description, the mind seems to go to that, to attain to it. It is lifted out of itself into something beyond, and although it falls back, still it remembers that into which it has entered. So this memory we have to understand more deeply. It's not just what happened in the last few days. It's not just what happened in the last few years. It's also the imprint of the memory in the last few lives and before. The original memory, the memory of your origin, and then the repeated partial awakenings and approaches across lives, which we have worked on. And depending on the maturity of the soul, that has built up sufficiently that even from your childhood, even when the mind is bound in whatever littleness, programmings, heredity, circumstances, something feels that, or it recognizes that when the opportunities come and very quickly orients the life in that direction. If we can consciously call on that memory, we can speed up the process. The beauty of it is it's already there in us. Very often we will feel, especially when we first turn to the spiritual life, there are other pulls also in our nature. There are pulls of attraction, of repulsion, of various other types. Especially the attractions which are stronger tend sometimes to collide or confuse the higher and more essential, purer, spiritual attraction, which is not so compelling and forceful. And so when you have this contradiction, instead of fighting it, simply shift attention to the memory of that which you seek to develop more. Dwell on its memory and what it feels like, and remember that more, and that grows more intense, more vivid, and the other fades or feels somehow less interesting, less satisfying, less worthwhile. Automatically this differentiation takes place without struggle, without conflict. You find yourself turning to that which is more precious. The error we make is to bind ourselves to the forms. This is how the religions develop. When we sat with our master at this location, we felt this exaltation. When the master did this, we felt like this. We follow and repeat the same thing. This is how generally the ritual form becomes more fixed. I have shared on other occasions this very sweet story of the yogi who had a pet cat, and every time he would meditate, he would tie the cat to a pillar because to prevent it from jumping on his lap and disturbing him. And so the yogi goes on a pilgrimage, tells his disciples, take care of things. When he comes back, in those days you had to travel by bullock cart, so he comes back in a year, and now he finds his hermitage surrounded by shops, and they're all selling cats. And so he's wandering, looking at, what is this? And every shopkeeper says, buy my cat, genuine descendant of the master's cat. Tie him to a pillar and you will get perfect meditation. The story shows us how easy it is to focus on the form and forget why that form or the thing which gave that form value. The origin of most religious practices or most religious forms, whether you shave your head, you grow your head, whether you wear a dress this way, that way, whether you tie this color or the other, all goes back to things like this. Sri Aurobindo points out every religion has two components: the temporal, which is often made of social and other constructs of this kind, and the essential or eternal component, which is always not bound to form. You will find often two traditions colliding because one says you must offer like this, another says you must offer like this. Whether your hand is pointing up or down, no, that's the wrong way, mine is the right way. You know what? How your hand was makes no difference at all. It's the spirit in which you offer. And maybe you can offer yourself without any flowers, without any hands, just be and give yourself. And that's the most direct perhaps. And so there are also traditions which remind you that the inner is more important than the outer and so on. But the point was that initially became important because it helped you to recall, to remember, and relive. People go even now to certain spaces where the Buddha meditated, because in being in that space, you are as if closer to him. In being in that space, it is as if you can relive or imbibe that which he experienced. Except that some of his most intense followers would go away from those spaces precisely because they have become tourist attractions. They prefer to go somewhere else where people won't bother them. But we have also seen equally that the divine presence can be called anywhere, and it does not matter where you are, precisely because the presence is not bound to form and objects. We have seen things used by masters in which the consciousness has gone away. And we've seen things which were not used by the masters, which were kept there, and every day an invocation done, and they're filled with the power and the presence, although they were physically never touched by the master. So somehow when you look more deeply, the form is unimportant, or it is useful to the extent that it helps you remember and re-enter the experience. That's all that matters. But the best is to focus directly on the memory of the experience itself, not the forms which led or supported it, and recall that. So it is lifted out of itself into something beyond, and although it falls back, still by the mind, the will of knowledge in the mental thought continually and at last continuously remembers that into which it has entered. So now comes a very important thing. What in your mind is turning to that and remembering? He says, the will of knowledge in the mental thought. So let's say I had that experience. Right now I do not have it. At best I have a distant memory of it. If at all I remember, I don't feel anything immediately. And yet there is a will in the mental thought, the will which can direct consciously and want to recover, want to hold, want to turn thought in this direction. But he says it is will of knowledge. You must want to know, you must want to recover that. And it is this which brings you back again and again. And so there is as if a discipline, a conscious effort to recall and to remember. And then he uses two words, continually, and at last continuously remembers that. Continually is something which is regularly done, which is repeated in a succession. Continuously is without a break. So at first the memory is continually, that means every morning, every evening you have your routine, or every break in my work I pause, I remember. But eventually it becomes continuous. It is as if the remembrance is never lost. You see the difference between these two words we can see in this way. We eat continually throughout our life. Okay? That means every day at your fixed time you are eating continually. Your heart beats continuously throughout your life. It cannot stop. Okay? The continually to continuously. Repetitions, but eventually there is this continuity. And at last, that's as if a great breakthrough. There's a long period of repetition which prepares for something which will never be lost again. At last, continuously remembers that into which it has entered. Now again, this vocabulary tells you something. You are here and you entered into something, that state of exaltation. You entered into something which is not this. So when you have entered into something which is not this, you cannot stay for long because you have to come back to this which you are. But the memory can be continuous until some part of you as if remembers and holds the link continuously. And at that point what happens? That into which you have entered, it can seize you. You have made yourself available to it, it can seize you and hold you. And even though something in you tends to drop, it doesn't let go. It pursues, it calls, it pulls you back. And this is what happens next. On this, the self through the mind ceases. Remember, mind can never reach the self, but it can turn to that as if, seems to go to that, seems to attain to that, enter in some exaltation. On this, the self through the mind can cease. The self can enter the mind and cease where you have reached this point. On this, the self through the mind ceases and repeatedly dwells. And so doing, it is finally caught. It is finally caught up into it, into the self. And at last able to dwell securely in that transcendence. So the whole mechanism of this turning and awakening is described in fine detail. And its reliance is on the self eventually taking up and holding and making possible the secure dwelling in the self. Although the mind has nothing of the self in it except perhaps something essential which allows you the memory, eventually it is possible to have this mind seized, the self seizing through the mind. And although now you are a mental being, conscious in a mental way, you have an experience of the self in which you are dwelling securely. But the self is not mind, but your mind is aware of it. And the self can suffuse and hold this part, at least, of the mind. And then you do not lose it ever. Dwell securely in that transcendence. It transcends the mind. It transcends its own mental individualization of the being, that which it now knows as itself. It ascends and takes foundation in the self of all. It takes foundation in the self of all, and in the status of self-joyous infinity, which is the supreme manifestation of the self. So as this station is taken, it opens eventually to this aspect of the self, which he describes as the supreme, the self-joyous infinity. This is the transcendent immortality. This is the spiritual existence which the Upanishads declare to be the goal of man, and by which we pass out of the mortal state into the heaven of the spirit. So this last section we will review next time in more detail, which will be next Sunday. For now we just reread these lines which describe the process of the secure experience and dwelling in the self. This, the self of man, since it is essential, it is the essentiality of a mental being, will do through the mind. In the gods, the transfiguration is effected by the superconscient itself visiting their substance and opening their vision with its flashes until it has transformed them. But the mind is capable of another action, which is only apparently movement of mind, but really the movement of the self towards its own reality. The mind seems to go to that, to attain to it. It is lifted out of itself into something beyond. And although it falls back, still by the mind, the will of knowledge in the mental thought, continually and at last continuously remembers that into which it has entered. On this, the self through the mind ceases and repeatedly dwells, and so doing it is finally caught up into it and at last able to dwell securely in that transcendence. It transcends the mind, it transcends its own mental individualization of the being, that which it now knows as itself. It ascends and takes foundation in the self of all and in the status of self-joyous infinity, which is the supreme manifestation of the self. This is the transcendent immortality. This is the spiritual existence which the Upanishads declare to be the goal of man. and by which we pass out of the mortal state into the heaven of the spirit. We can meditate on it for a few minutes.